Herman does all the pulling and all the pushing in his world, just like any superhero would be expected to. So after a week, they stopped digging and gave up the car, gave up the search for the alleged third body. I say alleged because I have a clear vision of Herman surfing down the side of the ravine on a snow slab and exiting gracefully at the bottom. The sheriff was adamant that people don't just walk away from an avalanche of that size. He admitted, though, that the possibility remains that Herman didn't exit the car until after the snow had come down. But with that scenario, the sheriff was convinced that Herman would have been too banged up to have gotten very far, burned or not burned. When summer eventually melted the snow out in the San Juans, and out by Ophir the snowy walls of the ravine had run into 1,000 icy streamlets, no Hermans showed up in the meltdown. The sheriff would probably argue that wolves or mountain lions hauled away the body before the summer search party had a chance to find him. It was about a month before the accident that Herman broke one of his kneecaps hiking down the ski mountain. He told me about it on the phone rather casually the last time we talked. He said he was taking it in stride, of course. He also made it sound like it was the best damn thing that ever happened to him. The bright side, he always found it. As if there was never another side for him. I know it's good to have a sense of humor about things, but what's good about a broken kneecap? Nothing. When Herman is around, whether or not you realize it, you try to do a good job with whatever you're doing. Or should I say, you can't help trying to do a good job, even though you're more than likely fudging up the thing. You try harder, you get nervous, and it's not because he's looking over your shoulder. You get the most nervous when he turns away and doesn't pressure you. When he makes you think he trusts you. But the whole time you think it isn't really true. What he's doing is letting you prove to yourself that you don't know what the hell you're doing. He's a big fan of the idea that failure builds character. Failure builds character. However, if that were really true, I would surely have way more character than I do. And he would have much, much less. How do you think superheroes get so powerful? From screwing up all the time? Yes, Herman America is a helpful son of a bitch. That's just what he is. And he's just as much a royal pain in the ass. Half the time, I didn't even want his help when he was giving it. Sure, it was usually helpful, but it's impossible to live with any kind of sanity in your life if all the ways you know how to do stuff, if all the ways you know how to do things rings in your head in someone else's voice. Even the stuff I managed to figure out ends up coming through my head sounding more like him than it does like me. I just don't believe it when a thought comes through. I just don't believe it when a thought comes through that seems original, like a full circle I close myself. It always seems too unlikely, even if I knew it wasn't something Herman debriefed me on word for word. I usually figured that he deserved the credit. Why was it that it was always the guy next to me who had center stage? Was I standing in a ditch? Was it a real-life rut I was in? Forgive me if this is painful. Or better yet, skip my introduction. Better yet still, just shoot me in the hand. True poetic justice, that would be. True poetic justice, that would be. When I reread Herman's journals, I'm convinced that the frustrated, judgmental voice he sometimes used was based on me, or inspired by me. It's like he created the monster out of a few dumb comments I made. It's like he created this monster out of a few dumb comments I made. I can't imagine he's imitating me, though, because his idiot guy says a lot of things this idiot never would have thought of. His idiot guy is still a goddamn genius from time to time. His journals make me feel like he was writing a long, painful script in which I was going to have to play myself, and I would end up reciting all the humiliating lines that he wrote for me just for that purpose, and I probably wouldn't even notice I was doing it. I wouldn't see the underlying smartness in my lines because they came from me in the first place. Furthermore, I'll have no claim on ironic authorship or any such thing, because ironic authorship is for people who think things through before they say them. And what are the chances that they're being any underlying brilliance in something I'm going to say. Accidental, maybe, but then accidents are usually not credited. Officially, Herman is still missing. Herman's dad, like me for one, believes he's still alive. There never was a funeral. Call it denial, sure, but wait until you've read his journals. Then decide whether or not you think he's dead. Then decide whether or not you think he's dead. The verdict is far from in. The verdict is far from in. No body or work. No corpse, no death. No body of work. No corpse, no death. But even if Herman did die down in that ravine, which he didn't, it's a little more important to talk about the living he did rather than the alleged dying. Even if he disappeared for good, it does no good whatsoever to go through life with regrets if you plan on making it through happy or sane. Whatever happened, happened. And I know the best thing we can do is remember him like he's still living, rather than dwell on the possibility that we might never see him again. With Herman, it's not a case of what is he doing if he really is still alive. It's more a case of look what he did before he slipped away. Just look at the stuff he did and all the good stuff he said. Look at what he did and how he did it and how cool he was the entire time he was doing all the things he did. A couple months passed before I recouped and got around to wondering whether other friends of Herman's had heard about his disappearance. I thought of one person in California, our mutual old friend, acquaintance, Beth Ann in California, and I asked his Telluride housemates whether he'd heard from her since the accident. As it turns out, they didn't know anything about her. That is, they knew Herman had some girl who called from California every once in a while, but they knew nothing about Beth Ann besides that. They did say they didn't receive any calls for him after the accident. Not a single call for Herman from anybody, including Beth. I called her just in case she'd heard about the accident, but she said she had. For reasons too numerous to mention, I didn't know what to say besides that, so I just said bye, and I told her that I didn't really think he was dead. I didn't think he was really dead. She just said yeah, and hung up the phone. What matters is his example. That's all that really matters, and nothing else. He said a good one. And if you ask me, he's still doing it somewhere. People like sociologists and psychologists should absorb a good dose of Herman. Herman said to me once that his least favorite kind of people are adults that don't realize that they're still the same kids that they were years ago. It's just that they get a little older and maybe now they have kids of their own. He said something about how most adults live in denial of their childhoods. And he said that it's a sad thing. He said that's a sad thing because it means their childhoods weren't all that great. Herman said that people use social science to guard their adulthood. They have to make up names for things and theories about behavior because the world ran out of ways for people like this to make a living. Herman said he never learned anything from a sociologist. He also said he gets really bored anytime someone starts talking about what groups of people think, as if groups of people could have a thought in their head. And I guess when there's a whole category of people who never told you something you agree with or something you didn't know already, then I guess it would be pretty easy to be bored by them. Myself, I haven't had such an experience yet. In fact, I'm pretty sure that most people in the world are a little more on the ball than I managed to be. Kids are probably the only ones I've got the jump on. Kids are probably the only ones I've got the jump on, in parentheses, over whom I have the jump, in parentheses. There's probably a better way at looking at this. If we're very open-minded, then we should be prepared to learn something from anyone we meet, right? Of course, Herman was just like that, is just like that. It's always been pretty clear to me that Herman was always making an effort to figure something out before someone. Was making an effort to figure something out, excuse me. Herman was always, let me back up one more line to the beginning of the sentence here. It's always been pretty clear to me that Herman was always making an effort to figure something out about someone. He always got something out of speaking to anyone he spoke to. Just by listening to a person, whether you think they're intelligent or not, you can always learn something. Herman would have you believe. I wouldn't want to give you the impression that Herman thought he was the smartest person around all the time. It's more like it just happened that he usually was the smartest person around, and always in the way that counts the most. He wasn't always the expert in the room on some subject or another, but he never claimed he was. What he'd do was ask the so-called expert to explain what it is they were an expert in, what their specialty is, and why they enjoy studying it so much. Then Herman would pull out something he remembered from high school physics class and confront the person who allegedly knew a lot more about it. More often than not, the person confronted by this inquisition would make an ass out of himself trying to relay some of his expertise. Herman wouldn't let up. He'd still be charming as hell, but he wouldn't back off. He'd give whatever it was an extra moment's thought, like physics, for example. And then he'd ask the most challenging question a guy like me never would have thought of. I know I shouldn't have brought this up without remembering any examples, but you'll have to take my word for it. To an outsider, someone who's never met the expert in physics or Tai Chi or whatever, Herman would probably sound more like an expert than the expert. That was just his way. He was smart, and it always showed. It doesn't show for everyone. It doesn't even show for the smart ones half the time. And that physics guy was supposedly quite a wizard, someone said. He just wasn't that great a talker. Talking well, to me, has always been a prerequisite. Talking well, to me, has always been a prerequisite for smartness. But that's only because Herman was always what I measured smart against. Maybe there's more to it. These days, there's all this talk about emotional intelligence. Maybe that has something to do with it. I always figured to be a great thinker, you have to be pretty spontaneous about it.